Um, Good afternoon. Before I begin, I just want to extend a heartfelt thanks to the organizers of this event who were gracious in inviting me here. I'm thankful that I have an opportunity to participate in such an important event on such an important yet tragic occasion. It's my first time here in your lovely city of Stockholm, and aside from just being delighted to see the city, I'm also happy to see that in Sweden there seems to exist a network of human rights activists and former political prisoners, and a network of local Swedish politicians and activists who are part of the diaspora. I hope that thanks to events like this, we can actually expand that network further to include those of us who are on the other side of the Atlantic in the US and Canada. There are obviously very large Iranian diaspora populations in those countries, and among them are individuals and groups which are very active politically. So we need to build such links and strengthen such ties among these activists. Ladies and gentlemen, this summer is the 20th anniversary of a massacre that stands without parallel in contemporary Iranian history. It is a grim and tragic anniversary. It is also an anniversary that has largely gone unacknowledged by Iranians and members of the international community. Aside from occasional events like this, which are held in various cities, one generally doesn't hear of major vigils held to commemorate the event. One doesn't hear of the world's major human rights organizations releasing reports to coincide with this anniversary. One generally doesn't hear any talk, except for the occasional disparate voice here and there, talking about obtaining justice in this case. Sadly, one generally doesn't hear anything at all about this crime. What we need now, on this 20th anniversary of the massacre, more than ever, is to shatter this pervasive silence surrounding the 1988 massacre. To do this, to play my part, I want to first recount the story of 1988. The story may be new to some in the audience, but for those of you who are former political prisoners, who bravely endured the barbaric prisons of the Iranian government, who were tortured physically and psychologically, this will be a repetition of what you already know. I apologize for that repetition, but I think it's important to tell and retell that story, not just as an explanation of why we must act, and not just as a way to ensure that a younger generation, my generation, understands the struggle. But we ought to repeat the story also as a form of resistance against the government that has tried since 1988 to bury the crime along with its victims. And this ought to be a resistance against the tendency in the diaspora community, among academics, lawyers, human rights activists, and people from various walks of life, a tendency among them to simply acquiesce in this induced historical amnesia. Telling this story is a resistance against the government that has committed a double crime against each of the political prisoners. The first crime was obviously the gruesome murder, and the second is the effort to completely erase them from the historical narrative. After speaking about the crime, I want to devote some time to assessing it under international criminal law. I want to talk about the elements of the crime and the categories of the perpetrators. And finally, I want to end by speaking about the tasks ahead and the legal and political challenges ahead for those seeking accountability in this case. It is important that another 20 years from now, we don't gather to talk about how the 40th anniversary of the massacre is unacknowledged. Let's hope instead that by that time, there will have been some justice. But that won't be easy, and I want to talk about why that is. So, with that by way of an introduction, let me first begin by discussing what happened in Iran's prisons 20 years ago. Iran's Islamic government had, immediately after the revolution in 1980-81, unleashed a wave of violence and executions. But even after these executions, the prisons remained full of prisoners of every age, gender, political affiliation. Mostly the political prisoners were affiliated with the Mujahideen, or were members of political prisoners in the 1980s had not been afforded anything even remotely resembling a fair trial. They were arrested on very vague charges, tortured, and then faced trials that lasted a minute or two. No defense offered, no appeals, no safeguards. And it's also worth pointing out, and I think this is very, very important, that these prisoners in prisons throughout the 1980s were generally in prison for very minor and non-violent offenses, and I put offenses in quotation marks, like selling books and newspapers, attending meetings, organizing solidarity groups, things of that sort. These folks were not involved in armed struggle. In late 1987 and early 1988, the government began a process of reinterrogating and recategorizing prisoners. Prisoners at prisons like Gohardash and Evin were typically brought, sometimes blindfolded, sometimes not, before panels to be re-questioned. The questions that were asked varied from prison to prison, and they were often based on political affiliation, but generally they would be asked about whether they accepted the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic, whether they'd be willing to publicly condemn their group, and how long their sentence was, and so on. Based on these answers, the prisoners were divided up based on their continued level of resistance and the length of their sentence, their religiosity, and so on. And just as a side note, I ought to mention that when I say prisoners were divided up based on the length of their sentences, something we ought to remember is that a large number of these prisoners had actually served their sentences completely by 1988. So for instance, someone would be arrested in 1980, they would get a 5-year sentence, and one would think that that person ought to be released in 1985, but the government would actually not even honor the rulings of its own kangaroo courts, and they would keep them in prison. Some of the so-called troublemakers, the prisoners that displayed more resistance, were at this time moved from general wards into solitary confinement, and some of the prisoners at this time after this recategorization were moved between wards and between prisons. This unusual reinterrogation really undermines the theory in my mind, the theory posited by many, that the executions that occurred in the summer of '88 were somehow the reaction of a panicked government that had been attacked militarily by an opposition group. In fact, the methodical way in which this reorganization occurred indicates that the government may have been laying the groundwork for such a massacre and was looking for some means of making the process more efficient. A number of former prisoners have pointed out that the reorganization had the effect of disrupting sophisticated communication networks that the prisoners had developed over the years. This may have in fact been part of the massacre preparation. Mid-July of 1988 rolled around, and Iran decided, after having faced several defeats in the battlefield in the last year or two of the war with Iraq, to accept the UN Resolution 598 and to end the war. Khomeini drank from the famous so-called poison chalice. The war was ended. The prisoners thought they were going home. They were very wrong. Shortly after the ceasefire was announced, the military wing of the Mujahideen launched a very ill-conceived attack on Iran's western border and was defeated soundly. Very shortly thereafter, the massacre began. And as an aside, I want to point out, as I just did a moment ago, that I really don't think there is much of a connection between the Mujahideen attack and the executions. I think the connection really is tenuous. On or about July 27th, the Iranian prisons went into lockdown. Visits were suspended, televisions were taken from wards, radio broadcasts were stopped, prisoners were not permitted to visit the infirmary. Basically, all communication between the prisons and the outside world ceased. Initially, the prisoners from left-wing secular parties were isolated and the massacre of the Mujahideen prisoners began. Those prisoners were taken from their cells, and in what must have been someone's idea of a perverse joke, the prisoners were told that they would be meeting with a commission that would grant them amnesty. The prisoners were taken, often blindfolded, and told to line up. When they met the commission, they realized that it was not an amnesty commission. It was, in fact, a commission that would later come to be called the Death Commission by the prisoners. It was comprised of representatives of the judiciary, the prosecutor's office, and the intelligence ministry. The figures on Tehran's commission were diverse, but some of the better-known figures are Jafar Nayeri, Murtaza Eshawi, Ibrahim Raisi, Mustafa Pur Mohammadi. Some have mentioned the name of Ismail Shushtari among the members of this death commission. The commission decided on whether or not a Mujahid prisoner would live or die, often based on one simple question: what political party do you belong to? To answer Mujahideen was to seal one's own fate. The correct answer was Munafiqeen. And for those in the audience that may not know this, the term Munafiqeen is actually a religiously loaded term. It means hypocrite, and it's a pejorative term that the government has often used against the Mujahideen. If a prisoner got past this initial threshold question, then he or she would be asked about his religious views, about his opposition to the government, about his or her willingness to publicly denounce the organization, his or her willingness to give the names of other resistant prisoners, and his willingness to go on missions to clear landmines from the war front. Based on these answers, the Death Commission would decide by a plurality of votes whether the prisoner would hang. In Evin, when it was decided that a prisoner was to be executed, he'd be guided to a line on the left side of the hallway, taken to a small room to write a last will, and then taken into the amphitheater to hang. The whole process, from start to finish, was a matter of minutes. The prisoners report that there was chaos in the lead-up to the death chambers, and often prison guards would take prisoners they didn't like and simply put them in the execution line. This is how matters of life and death were decided. During this time when the Mujahideen faced the massacre, the leftist prisoners were generally kept isolated and had no idea what was happening. There were clues about the massacre, however. One prisoner recalls seeing an Afghan prison worker coming in and miming a noose around his neck as a way to signal what was happening. The prisoners interpreted that to mean that perhaps Khomeini had died. Some heard a helicopter that would come twice a week and carry the roving members of the roving death commission. Some got Morse code messages tapped on the prison walls from Mujahideen prisoners about a massacre underway. But the prisoners just simply found this too hyperbolic and too unbelievable. Some in Gohadash prison saw guards with face masks entering the prison amphitheater, and they would see bodies being taken out of the prison. But they often thought that these were just the bodies of soldiers, Mujahideen soldiers killed in the skirmish at the border. In talking to prisoners and reading their memoirs, one is often struck by the fact that prisoner after prisoner noticed these clues, but did not immediately think that a massacre was underway. To them, it was just too unexpected that such a thing would occur. When the authorities finished with the Mujahideen in late August, they turned to the leftists. Some of the leftist prisoners had caught on to what was happening and were more prepared than the Mujahideen prisoners had been. Some of them gave strategic answers to questions about their political beliefs and their religious beliefs to ensure that they survived. By and large, though, they faced the same type of questioning as the Mujahideen prisoners had faced. And they also faced the same brutality, though the questioning they faced was often a little bit different. It had more of a theological element to it. There was really an effort to decipher whether or not these prisoners were murtad, like apostates, or muharibs, combatants against God. One scholar has actually referred to this as an inquisition in the classic sense of the term, and I really believe that to be the case. Perhaps the only group of prisoners to collectively escape death were leftist female prisoners. The Mujahideen women were mostly found to be combatants against God, and they were hanged. The female leftists, however, were found not to have sufficient agency as women to be deemed as apostates. So, as one commentator has noted, the Iranian government's misogyny, actually in this case, may have ended up saving women's lives. Of course, the female prisoners were subject to horrific floggings and beatings and so on afterwards, and a number simply committed suicide because they couldn't bear it. But they were generally not killed in that wave of executions. After about 3 months of this brutality, the families, who had for months been desperate for information, were notified and told to come and collect their loved ones' belongings. They weren't told about the date of the execution, the method, the burial spot, and they had to agree not to hold funerals or to erect public memorials to their loved ones. In fact, when a representative of the UN appeared in Iran to investigate allegations of human rights abuses, even the very small monuments that the families had built to members of their family were torn down. Immediately after the massacre, the government launched what can only be described as a fairly well-orchestrated denial campaign, in which its representatives spoke to the international media, they spoke to human rights organizations and international organizations, and simply denied that a massacre ever took place. People like Rafsanjani and Khamenei simply said that a few people had been killed, but they were Mujahideen combatants who were involved in the military attack on Iran. Abdullah Nouri, who would later become the darling of the reform movement and a close associate of President Khatami, and who was the interior minister in the 1980s, spoke to the UN and said that a campaign has been organized abroad alleging that invaders captured on the battlefield had been executed en masse, but he went on to simply deny that this had ever occurred. So, as I mentioned at the outset, after having told this story, I just want to talk a little bit about the massacre in the framework of international criminal law. Without delving too deeply into technical discussions, I want to point out that the 1988 massacre is almost a textbook definition of crimes against humanity. The concept of crimes against humanity is now firmly established in customary international law. It has a rich jurisprudence that began roughly in the early 20th century, and continued through the Nuremberg trials, and was really developed